I'm here to introduce Colin Layden. He's the political director in Texas for the Environmental Defense Fund. He works to ensure there is cohesion between stakeholders, policymakers, and elected officials. He is also managing EDF's electrical power grid work in Texas. His presentation is going to be on methane, which I'm going to let him tell you more about. And I'm really looking forward to this, especially being a former oil and gas attorney myself. His expertise lies in areas related to oil and gas, energy policy, ground level ozone, and air quality. And so, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Colin?
Hello, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Let me see here. We'll go with that. We're going to talk about methane and methane's impact on climate change. I'm going to quickly poll the audience. How many folks have heard about methane and its role towards climate change? Wow, that's impressive. Methane has been having what we've been calling the methane moment of late. Methane, which is, its molecular signature is CH4, as opposed to carbon dioxide, which is CO2. Methane is a short-term climate pollutant, and in fact, probably the most important short-term climate pollutant. It actually has an outsized role in the amount of warming that we're feeling today, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide.
Oh, do you have a clicker up there?
Oh, I do. Never mind. I didn't know that.
Just kind of hold it up again. Behind your back. Over here. Point at it. Point it over there. Point it at us. There you go.
Oh, wow. Did I go back? Okay. So what is methane? Well, it's an invisible gas, like most gases, and it's odorless. But what is it? Essentially, it is natural gas. When we are lighting our stove, we are burning methane. When we are heating our hot water with a natural gas hot water heater, that is methane that is being burning. So it is the primary ingredient of the natural gas that we use to heat our homes, create electricity, and it also serves as a feedstock for many other chemicals that get created at petrochemical facilities. So it has a lot of different uses. It is responsible, according to the IPCC, the United Nations Special Climate Group, for about 25% of the global warming that we are experiencing today. There are different sources of methane. We're going to primarily talk about methane from oil and gas industry, but real quick, the primary sources are industrial methane, of which oil and gas is part of, agricultural, and then also naturally occurring methane. When plant and biomass breaks down through the natural process, methane is released. And roughly speaking, the amount of methane in the atmosphere, and this is a bit controversial, is split in thirds between agriculture, industrial, primarily oil and gas, and then naturally occurring methane. Next slide. Oh, it's me again. I'm sorry. It's been so long since I've had a clicker. It's kind of a... I'm going to go real quickly through this slide because it's a little bit complicated, but what it's really trying to do is illustrate the importance of short-term climate pollutants and addressing those as well. If you see the top slide there is if we did nothing on climate change. The one below it is if we only address CO2, and then some of the other ones down below, the two bottom ones, when you see that dip in the early years, that's if we address the short-term climate pollutants like methane. And really what it's kind of illustrating is if we do methane now, we can actually impact what we're experiencing in the climate. It buys us some time to mitigate the much more difficult carbon dioxide. So how much methane is leaking from the oil and gas system? It's a very actually complicated question that EDF, the organization I'm with, began working on about 12 years, and we partnered with many different academic institutes, including University of Texas, as well as oil and gas industry itself, to try and quantify how much methane was happening. If you remember, the hydraulic fracturing revolution took off in roughly the mid-aughts, and Texas was a focus of that. The Barnett Shale up in the Dallas-Fort Worth region was the very first natural gas shale play, is what they call it, getting it out of shale instead of your typical reservoir. That has since moved to Pennsylvania, the Marcellus Shale. I think our previous speaker mentioned that. And then in Texas, of course, we have multiple oil and gas basins, including the largest in the US, the Permian Basin in West Texas. So we began partnering about 12 years ago at the beginning of the shale revolution to try and characterize what was going on with methane emissions from oil and gas in all of the different value chain pieces: the production, the transport, local distribution. And the real reason at the time was, there was natural gas was touted as a bridge fuel, a way to get us off coal, while waiting for newer technologies that are even cleaner to come along. And to a large extent, that's played out and continues to play out. But the real question was, well, if methane's escaping, then maybe replacing a coal plant with gas isn't quite as great as we thought. And then if we can control that methane, mitigate for it, that would help. So according to our research over the years, what we're coming to find is that the methane problem is in the oil and gas industry is extremely large. I believe this 13 million metric tons has actually been revised upward, but that's about 60% more than what the EPA right now tracks through its inventories. They're aware of this. The inventory that they keep on methane is getting better and better, depending on what administration is in. But it is getting better and better as we get more science, more data. But it's still not up to what the latest science says as far as how much methane is out there. That's enough to supply 10 million homes, so it's a lot of natural gas. It's a lot of money that's wasted. And of course, it's an incredibly large climate pollutant, about 200 million vehicles worth. So what you're seeing on the picture here is a flare stack. A flare is a device in the oil and gas world, particularly in oil fields, where the gas, for whatever reason, either the operator doesn't want to hook up the gas because they're there for the oil. That happens, by the way. Or if there's some sort of a event that happens, an equipment malfunction, the gas is routed through a flare stack and it's burned. It's better to burn it than it is to release it directly in the atmosphere. The problem is that these flares malfunction quite a bit. So if you were driving down the highway in your car and you saw a flare stack, you would not see that picture. That is taken by an infrared camera that is specialized in detecting and seeing methane emissions. So that is a black cloud of methane smoke coming out of the flare stack, which you cannot see with the naked eye. And that's happening all across the Permian Basin, as well as other oil and gas developments. So we wanted to take a look. We did a lot of research over the last 15 years, but we hadn't ever actually done a big research project in an oil play, meaning they were in a basin in which they were primarily there for the oil. But a lot of natural gas comes up with oil. And that's particularly true in the Permian Basin, and we had never done a study in the Permian Basin. And in fact, the Permian Basin, as I mentioned, depending on whether people believe the numbers from Saudi Arabia, is either the largest or the second largest oil and gas field in the world. And it's certainly the largest in the US. And of course, methane is a big problem in Texas because we are the largest oil and gas producing state. We account for about 25 to 30% of all the oil produced in the US right now, as well as about 30% of the natural gas that's produced. Consequently, we're responsible for about a third of the methane emissions that the US produces in the oil and gas sector, and that's roughly 5 million metric tons per year. That's enough gas over 5 million homes, and that's obviously more methane than any other state, as I mentioned. I mentioned flaring. You know, flaring isn't typically an issue in a pure gas field. So in, say, Pennsylvania or Ohio, where they're just there for natural gas and not oil, you don't see very many flares, because why would you burn the gas that you're there to get? It's of particular interest in oil fields, and the two worst offenders in the US are the Permian Basin from a volume perspective, and then the Bakken, which is in North Dakota. At one point, the Bakken was flaring something like 35% of all the natural gas that was produced. It's gotten better. I think it's at 19%. So burning this gas, it's obviously a waste. It's incredibly wasteful. It's a source of pollution, not only if the methane is escaping because the flare is unlit, but also for folks that are living by oil and gas facilities. If you would never want to live next to a flare that was right next to it. It's loud, it stinks, it's putting out carbon dioxide and other toxics as well, such as formaldehyde and other carcinogens. This is just a quick picture to illustrate sort of the issue, the problem. This is a satellite taken at night. All of these are essentially, they've taken out the cities, but you know, this is what the satellite sees from flares at night. I think you can see the Permian out in West Texas. Down below San Antonio is the Eagle Ford Shale. And then various, up on the top, that's the Bakken, the very top. This is just a policy that EDF and many others are touting here. Routine flaring by our definition is essentially when you go into an oil field and you don't hook up the gas because you're there for the oil and you figure you'll get to the gas later, and so consequently you're flaring all the gas. We call that routine flaring. It's flaring that's really just convenience. Flaring for convenience. There will always be flaring in oil development because there will be equipment that malfunctions, and there has to be a safe way to get rid of that gas, and burning it through a flare is safer than releasing it directly into the atmosphere. However, it should not be public policy that you're allowed to hook up an oil well without taking care of the gas that is also going to be coming up with that oil. I will say that there are several states that have a zero routine flaring policy. Colorado, New Mexico recently passed one. Alaska has had one for many, many years. So this is not anything radical. We do not have a zero routine flaring policy in the state of Texas. So researching oil and gas, or methane in the Permian, you know, it's a massive, massive industrial endeavor out there. It is the largest oil and gas field. It's, you know, multiple thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, and then there's hundreds and hundreds of companies. That's one of the unique things about oil and gas in the US is it's many, many companies, and the leases are oftentimes private, so it's not public land. So that creates a little bit of a headache in trying to deal with the regulatory scheme and all that sort of things, because you have so many companies. This is the project we put together to figure out what was happening in the Permian. How am I on time? Good? Okay. So we put together a science project. We partnered with the University of Pennsylvania. We partnered with the University of Wyoming, and then a couple of private contractors. But we wanted to, once again, quantify and characterize methane emissions from the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico. We also wanted to make all of that data public, so we created a website that you can go to, permianmap.org, in which all of our measurements, after they've been quality assured and analyzed by our analysts, are then transferred to a visible format that you can see on the website. So all of these little dots are, in fact, measurements that we've taken of facilities. That square was our original study area. We couldn't study the entire Permian, so we picked a 10,000 square kilometer area that went into both New Mexico and Texas, and did the bulk of our measurements there, although we've expanded outside that measurement area on flares as well as some other things too. So the major findings, what we found, Our original estimate was about 3.5% of all of the natural gas being produced in the Permian was escaping into the atmosphere. That's since been revised to around 3%. It's changed over the last year and a half, 2 years, but it's roughly sticking pretty solid around 3%. That's been confirmed by other studies outside of Environmental Defense Fund's work. That's 15 times higher than what some of the leading companies on this issue have said they'd like to achieve. It's twice as much methane as any other oil field in the country. And then we also found through our work on flares that 10% of the flares are malfunctioning at any given time, and 5% of them are completely unlit at any given time. So one of the products of this research was really getting a better understanding of how much of a problem flaring is in relation to methane emissions in the oil and gas world, because they don't work as often as they should. And they're malfunctioning, and then the methane is escaping into the atmosphere. Well, so what's being done about this issue? And this slide is a little bit confusing, but I'll just try to summarize it. Back in 2015, the Obama administration put out the first ever methane regulations, and they were for new sources only. So it was only applicable to any new facility that was going in or that was being built, like an oil well or compression station. You can imagine different types of facilities, but it was only for new sources from 2015. Well, as you might imagine, that leaves the bulk of existing sources unregulated. At the time, the Obama administration's EPA was moving forward with existing source regulations. They were gathering the data that they would need to start writing those sorts of regulations. But then the Trump administration came in and stopped the EPA from doing anything more on existing sources, and in fact tried to roll back the existing new source standards. They weren't quite that successful, both from a legal perspective as well as a regulatory perspective, but they did do a little bit of damage on that. Since then, with the Biden administration coming in fact, on day one, the Biden administration put out a series of executive orders, and as part of that, creating and establishing methane regulations was part of that executive order. So they have been moving forward and recently released enhanced regulations for the existing new source rule. So they clawed back what the Trump administration had weakened, as well as made them tougher. And then also proposed the first ever methane regulations for existing sources. So this is a big deal. That comment period for that first proposed rule that they've put out ends on January 31st of this year. They are going to be putting out a subsequent, what they're calling a supplemental rule in the spring, so there will be more time for folks to comment on these methane rules. But what it's really important is for the EPA to hear from people in Texas, because they know that Texas is the leading oil and gas state in the country, and that they often hear from industry from Texas about regulations, but they need to hear as much as they can from folks who are engaged on the issue and want to have their voice heard. So you can go to the EPA website and submit a comment before January 31st on this particular rule. And as I said, there will be subsequent things coming in the spring as well. The ambition is to cut methane emissions by 45% over the next decade, which is easily achievable. It will improve the quality of life of folks living nearby oil and gas wells, and it will do quite a bit to help our climate. And I think I think I'm already done, and we can take questions and answers. And feel free to go back to anything from the beginning. January 31st on this first proposal.
On the slide right before this one, I noticed it said something about the one more up. No, going towards the end, I'm sorry.
Oh,
There you go.
yeah.
Nearly 1 million wells built before 2015, estimated at more than 90% of the existing wells. I'm curious, what year did they start building those wells?
Well, if they're,
How far back does that actually go?
I don't know specifically how accurate that is in the sense of we've obviously been drilling oil and gas wells for 100 years or more. So some of those wells could be from, decades and decades ago. But I would think that, just in the last, I'm not up to speed, I think, on the latest numbers, but I mean, we've drilled thousands and thousands of oil and gas wells in Texas since the early 2000s.
Okay, thank you.
I've got one from the chat. I've got one from online from the Zoom readers. One, or from the people watching and listening on Zoom. One is, what is the identifying number of the rule that you're talking about?
Oh, geez. I knew somebody would ask something that I don't know the answer to that offhand. I'd have to look it up on my.
But what people want to know is how they can comment.
That's right.
Right. Well, if you were to Google EPA methane regulation comments, you would probably be taken directly to the page where you could submit comments.
And
Also, we'll post it.
we'll post it. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
I grew up in New Mexico, and in the 50s, there was flaring all over the place. They discovered oil up around the Farmington area, and in that area, everywhere you turned, there were flares. So that's been going on for a long time. My question is, what would they do if they couldn't burn those flares? Where did they put that gas?
Yeah, so interesting history in Texas on that issue, too. East Texas was the first major oil field discovered in Texas, and they used to say you could drive from Houston to Dallas without turning your headlights on at night because the flares would light up all the way. And the Railroad Commission stepped in the 40s and made the first flaring rules in the state, and in fact shut in the oil wells until they provided the pipelines necessary to take the gas away so that they weren't flaring it. So there are a few different things you can do with the gas. Number one, you can hook it up to a pipeline, and then that gas would be put to a productive use at some endpoint, whether it goes to a power station or it might even go into your home if you're using natural gas to heat your home. So the pipeline is typically the preferred solution. But there are also on-site solutions for the gas. Sometimes you can use the gas to power the actual, some of the facilities on site. So, better to put it to a productive use than to just burn it as a waste. And as we see, the flares aren't a very efficient way to actually burn the gas either.
So they're just doing what they think is the easiest thing to do.
Oftentimes, yes. Sometimes there are flares from emergency situations, and of course, that's unavoidable.
So in Fort Worth, in front of our house, we had a fracking thing going on, and they're bothering our neighborhoods, causing all kinds of disturbances, and they're going to this trouble to extract methane, and yet at oil wells, the methane escapes. Is there no financial incentive to capture that?
Yeah,
I
there
don't
is.
get it.
That's a good point. I mean, overall, methane is one of the more solvable problems because it is something that has value. The gas has value. It hasn't had enough value of late. For many, many years now, we've been operating in a low-value gas situation where the gas was not all that expensive. But I think what the real issue is in an oil field is when they sort of put the economic modeling together on the well itself. The natural gas is a nice sort of extra margin of profit, but it's not what the overall economics of the well are built around. It's built around the oil. So if, say, it's going to take us, they could say, look at a particular set of wells and say, well, there's a lot of natural gas that's going to come up with this oil, and we need to put in gathering lines to take the gas to a pipeline that's 2 miles away. That's going to cost us X number of dollars. We'll get a return on that after 3 or 4 years. But you know what? We want to drill these wells and get the oil going, and then we're just going to sell them to a buyer. So we'll skip the hooking up of the natural gas. That's one scenario.
I kind of feel like I'm sitting here watching Don't Look Up, the movie. Have you seen that?
Wait, which movie?
It's called Don't Look Up, the new movie.
Oh, yes, I've seen it.
Well,
yeah.
the nerdy scientist, Leonardo DiCaprio, is trying to convince President Meryl Streep that there's this meteorite that is just hurling toward space, through space, and is going to destroy the planet. And her advisors are saying, well, how do we pull this? How do we scale this? How do we, And my point being, this is awful. And the very idea that oil and gas companies, I mean, if they're one of their flares malfunctions, they ought to be shut down until they get it fixed. How we are sitting here nodding and saying, yeah, this is just the way it works. This is crazy.
Yeah.
And we're still subsidizing oil companies with your tax dollars in mind.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take away from your outrage, because I feel it daily, believe me. But I will say there are some good things happening on methane. It was a focus of COP26. I think it was over 100 companies took the methane pledge, pledging to reduce their methane emissions by 35%, I think up until 2030. And there has been movement in the oil and gas industry on this issue. There are many, many companies, including some that operate in Texas, that have committed to a very, very low methane escape. I think it's 0.25%. Permian, I said, was 3%, so significantly lower. They are investing some resources into actually mitigating their methane. They recognize that if they're going to have any success with natural gas continuing as a fuel supply, that they have to deal with the methane problem. Unfortunately, many of them would like that to be done as slowly as possible. We don't have time. So there are some good things that are happening. It's not all a bad story, but it is serious, and it needs to be. It's having an impact now, and it's something we can do. There are very few things when you look at climate change that can have an immediate impact. Most of what we're doing is for our children, grandchildren, and their children. But this is one thing we can actually do for ourselves over the next 20, 25 years and reduce the amount of warming we're experiencing. Maybe avoid some negative feedback loops that we otherwise would have stumbled into. So, it's one of the positive stories on climate change, I think.
Yes, at the very beginning you were talking about natural gas and how it was supposed to be a bridge fuel. Can you explain that a little more? I mean, there was a time when, all the buses were being changed to natural gas, and what happened?
Well, so what it really comes down to is when you burn natural gas, it's got 50% less CO2 at the point of ignition than coal does. So you get a 50% CO2 benefit by burning natural gas versus coal. You also get a significant reduction in what's called NOx and SOx, which are two pollutants that cause ozone. So there are tailpipe benefits. So when you're switching from natural gas, say from a gasoline-powered car, you do see some benefits at the tailpipe. So that's what was driving sort of the automotive side of it was, it's less pollution for our cities. And then from the carbon perspective, that's what was driving it. But if that loss rate for that natural gas, if the methane loss rate is higher than 2.8%, you're over a 100-year period, you're not really benefiting by switching that out from coal. Now, the U.S.'s CO2 emissions have gone down over the last 15 years in the power sector, the electric generation sector. And a large part of that is because we've switched a lot of our coal plants to natural gas, and renewables are coming on strong. So those two things together are why we have seen a reduction. It's reasonable for countries like India and China, who haven't had their full industrial revolution like we did, to say, you know what, we are going to clean up our carbon emissions. We can't go all renewable. You can't go all renewable yet. So we are going to switch some of our coal plants to natural gas, and we are going to get a CO2 benefit from that. And that's true. as long as the methane emissions are taken care of.
Is there a website that we could go to with guidance on contacting the EPA? And if so, what would you want us to, I guess, say to the EPA?
So I am going to send B what we are calling the Methane Comment Toolkit, which will have sample language for submitting comments or writing a letter or, to the newspaper and all that sorts of stuff, along with links to the website. So I will make sure B gets that and she can post that to the website for you all. I see B nodding, so got that right.
Oh, I just wanted to say that United Methodist Women is working on the methane issue. Climate justice is one of our priorities, and Liz Lee is the staff person for United Methodist Women. If you go to the United Methodist Women website, you will find information about all of this. So, and additionally, I'd like to say that right before you came before us, we were doing a session that was climate and health. And we talked about methane in that session. And so now we're doing climate and methane. And what do you say about health?
Yeah, well, I think I think half of the previous speaker was excellent. One of the issues and difficulties on advocating in oil and gas, and this question came up for the previous speaker, is it's difficult to engage communities in a lot of the oil and gas world because, first of all, a lot of it is rural. Most of our oil and gas development is done in very sparsely populated areas. And then most of the population either works in the oil and gas industry or has a close family member that works in the oil and gas industry. So that makes the advocacy side of things difficult. Now, to your question specifically, health from oil and gas has been documented very well. Oil and gas pollution contributes to the ozone that we experience here in the U.S. That's why there's specific EPA guidelines around oil and gas development in urban communities because of its contribution to ozone, so the air we breathe. There have been some studies linking flares in the Eagle Ford Shale to pregnancy problems, particularly for Hispanic women. I can post a link to that study as well. I think that was done out of the UCLA. So there's no doubt that reducing oil and gas emissions and methane emissions will greatly reduce air pollution. And as I mentioned, there's also hazardous, what they call them HAPs, hazardous chemicals and pollutants that come out of oil and gas right nearby. So all of these things that reduce methane emissions also help reduce those pollutants as well. And there's one more over here too.
Okay. The picture of the flaring from space.
Yeah.
They're still drilling in California, right?
They are still actively drilling in California.
So I don't see any flares. Is that their regulations are?
It's probably a combination of regulatory and just production intensity. California does have much more oil and gas production than most people think, but it's still not as significant. And the oil and gas fields that are there are much older, so typically not as much flaring.
I learned from yesterday's thing that we're supposed to ask for what we want. And if we're going to be talking to EPA, when we ask for air, wind, and electric, and solar, and those things, renewables, so that we're safer and our environment is better. Instead of saying, no, we want this or that, ask for those things that would work.
I fully support that.
Thank you. Any more?
And from the Zoom, this is the last one. Okay. The question from online, from the chat, is what about methane flaring at landfills?
Yeah, that's a good question. At landfills, as I said, methane is created in the natural process. So our landfills, as we bury food waste and other biomass, breaks down and creates methane, and they'll oftentimes flare it. It is better to flare that than to let it seep out and just go into the atmosphere. There have been some efforts to use, and some actually do exist, where they route that gas and use it for a productive use. Some people call that renewable gas. It's a tricky word, but it can be used as a replacement for methane that's harvested out of the ground, fossil methane. So there are some solutions that are, better than burning it from the landfill. But if you see a flare at a landfill, better that they're burning it than releasing it. Thank you.
Thank you.